My brother Maverick deliberately crushed my ribs with a wooden cabinet. My parents called it an accident and demanded I stay quiet to protect his reputation. The emergency room doctor believed them, but Dr. Esther Blackwood, the radiologist, took one look at my x-rays and said, "Someone tried to seriously hurt you." She made phone calls that destroyed my family's lives and sent Maverick to prison.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
2 years later, when I inherited everything he thought was his, he finally understood what real consequences looked like. Growing up as a Castellanos meant understanding the hierarchy. Maverick was the crown prince of our family empire, charming, successful, and completely untouchable. At 28, he worked alongside Dad in Castellanos Construction, the business that had made our family prominent in Millbrook Heights, Colorado. I was 24, the afterthought daughter, who designed logos for environmental nonprofits from my small apartment downtown. "Mav's going to take over the business when I retire," Dad would say proudly during family dinners. "He's got the vision, the connections." Mom would nod approvingly while cutting Maverick another slice of her famous tres leches cake. Meanwhile, I'd sit at the far end of their mahogany dining table, invisible unless they needed someone to clear dishes or listen to Maverick's latest success story. The golden child status came with privileges that seemed to have no limits. When Maverick wrecked his Mustang in college, Dad bought him a newer one without question. When he got arrested for a bar fight at 25, Mom hired the best lawyer in Colorado Springs, and the charges mysteriously disappeared. "Boys will be boys," she'd say with that indulgent smile that never appeared when discussing my choices. I learned early that questioning Maverick's behavior was futile. When I was 16 and told our parents that he'd borrowed my car without asking and returned it with a dent, they'd made me apologize to him for being dramatic about material things. When I mentioned that he'd been going through my room while I was at college, Mom dismissed it as brotherly concern for your safety. The family business reflected this same hierarchy. Castellanos Construction was Dad's pride and joy, a company he'd built from nothing into one of the most successful contractors in the region. Maverick had been groomed from childhood to take over, spending summers on job sites, learning the trade, building relationships with suppliers and clients. His corner office at the company headquarters was decorated with awards and photos of completed projects, all achievements that had been handed to him on a silver platter. Meanwhile, my career in graphic design was treated as a hobby that I'd eventually outgrow. "When are you going to find something more stable?" Mom would ask during family gatherings. "Maybe something in the business where Maverick could keep an eye on you." The implication was always clear. Maverick was the future of our family name, the keeper of our legacy, the son who would carry on Dad's vision. I was the spare, the afterthought, the daughter whose primary value lay in supporting her brother's ambitions. Every family photo, every celebration, every important decision reinforced this dynamic. But what none of us knew was that behind Maverick's golden facade, something dark and desperate was growing. The pressure to maintain his perfect image, combined with access to company finances and no real oversight, had created the perfect conditions for disaster. While our parents praised his business acumen and responsibility, Maverick was systematically destroying everything they'd built, one poker game at a time. The irony was bitter. The son they'd trusted with everything was the one who would ultimately destroy it all. And when that destruction came, it would be their overlooked daughter who emerged as the true inheritor of our family's values. But that realization was still days away, hidden behind the lies and manipulation that kept our family's dysfunction functioning. As I sat in my small apartment that Saturday morning, designing a logo for a local environmental group, I had no idea that within hours, my brother would try to seriously injure me in a desperate attempt to secure an inheritance that was never his to claim. I had no idea that the very family who'd spent my entire life teaching me that Maverick mattered more would soon be asking me to sacrifice my truth to protect his lies. All I knew was that when my phone rang with his voice asking for help, I still believed that family meant something. I still believed that my brother, despite all his flaws, would never deliberately hurt me. I was wrong. Everything changed when Abuela Esperanza passed away last spring. Her Victorian house on Sycamore Lane had been the heart of our family for 60 years. The place where she'd taught me to paint watercolors in her secret studio, where she'd whispered stories about her youth as an artist in Mexico City, where she'd shown me that creativity mattered as much as business success. Abuela had always been different from the rest of our family. While Dad and Mom focused on building wealth and status, she'd spent her life creating beauty. Her house was filled with her paintings, sculptures, and collections from her travels around the world. The converted garage had become her studio, a magical space where canvases lined the walls and the smell of oil paints mixed with jasmine from her garden. Art is the only honest work, she'd tell me as we painted together on Sunday afternoons. Everything else is just noise, mija. Remember that when the world tries to make you forget who you are. Those Sunday sessions had been my refuge throughout childhood. While Maverick was at the construction sites learning to operate heavy machinery, I was learning to see light and shadow, to capture emotion in brushstrokes, to express truths that words couldn't convey. Abuela never made me feel like my interests were less valuable than my brother's. If anything, she seemed to understand that creativity required a different kind of strength. During her final weeks, when the cancer had made her too weak to paint, she'd asked me to come alone to her house. The request had surprised our family. Usually, Maverick was included in all important conversations, but Abuela had been insistent. "There's something I need to tell you, mija," she'd said, her weathered hands surprisingly strong as they gripped mine. We were sitting in her studio, surrounded by decades of her artwork. The afternoon light filtered through the skylight she'd had installed, casting everything in a golden glow that made even her pain seem beautiful. She'd led me to an old wooden chest in the corner of the studio, pulling out a manila envelope sealed with red wax. "I've made my decision about the inheritance," she'd said quietly. "The house, the studio, the land, everything is yours." I'd stared at her, certain I'd misunderstood. "But Abuela, everyone expects what they've been told to expect," she'd interrupted gently. "But I've watched both of my grandchildren grow up. I've seen who has integrity and who doesn't, who creates and who destroys, who loves this house for what it represents and who sees only dollar signs." She'd pressed a small brass key into my palm, the key to a safety deposit box where she kept her most valuable paintings and jewelry. "Maverick thinks success means taking over his father's business and building bigger buildings, but you understand that real success means staying true to yourself, even when the world tells you that you're not enough." The envelope contained her final will, already notarized and legally binding, but she'd structured it in a way that would give our family time to see who really deserved the inheritance. The official reading was scheduled for the Monday after her funeral, with family lawyer Theodore Ashworth presenting it as an open competition based on character, responsibility, and commitment to family values. "Let them think Maverick has a chance," she'd said with a knowing smile. "Sometimes people reveal their true nature when they think they might lose something they want. I have a feeling this process will show everyone exactly who deserves to carry on our family's legacy." I'd tried to protest, to tell her that this would cause problems in our family, but she'd shaken her head firmly. "Mija, our family already has problems. We just pretend we don't. This inheritance will either heal those problems or expose them completely. Either way, the truth needs to come out." She'd made me promise not to tell anyone about our conversation or about the sealed envelope. "The lawyer has his instructions. Everyone will learn the truth at the same time. But I need you to be prepared for their reaction." Looking back now, I realize Abuela had known exactly what kind of person Maverick really was. She'd seen through his charm and success to the entitled, desperate man underneath. She'd probably suspected he might be capable of violence when his inheritance was threatened. What she couldn't have predicted was just how far he'd go to claim what he thought was his. She couldn't have known that her decision to leave me everything would push Maverick to attempt something so calculated and cruel. But she'd given me the strength to survive what was coming, even if she couldn't protect me from it entirely. The will reading was scheduled for next Monday, just 3 days away. Maverick had been confident for weeks, making plans for renovating the house, talking about selling some of Abuela's artwork to fund his wedding to Sloan.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He'd even started referring to the property as my inheritance in casual conversation. If he'd known the truth, if he'd realized that Abuela had already chosen me, would he have reacted differently? Would he have found another way to solve his financial problems? Or would the knowledge have made him even more dangerous? I'll never know for certain, but as I sat in my apartment that Saturday morning, still unaware of Maverick's gambling debts or his desperation, I felt a mixture of anticipation and dread about Monday's announcement. I knew I deserved Abuela's house and everything it represented, but I also knew that my family wouldn't see it that way. I just never imagined that my brother would try to seriously injure me to prevent the truth from coming out. What none of us knew was that Maverick had been living a double life for the past 2 years. While our family celebrated his success at Castellano's construction, he'd been systematically destroying everything Dad had built, one poker game at a time. It had started innocently enough, business dinners with clients that moved to upscale casinos in Denver. Maverick told our parents these were networking opportunities, ways to build relationships with potential investors and high-end customers. Dad had been proud that his son was thinking strategically about growing the business. But the networking had evolved into something much darker. Private games and hotel suites with stakes that started at $5,000 per hand. Underground poker rooms where construction executives and real estate developers gambled away company assets while their families slept peacefully at home. Maverick had been good at it initially, good enough to win big and convince himself he had a system. He'd started using those wins to fund an increasingly expensive lifestyle, the engagement ring for Sloan that cost more than most people's cars, the lease on a luxury condo downtown, the designer suits that made him look like the successful businessman our parents believed him to be. But gambling addiction doesn't care about talent or intelligence. The wins became less frequent, while the losses grew exponentially larger. Maverick began borrowing against his trust fund, then against his future inheritance, then against company accounts that he had access to as Dad's heir apparent. By the time Abuela passed away, he owed Vincent Vinny Torino over $50,000, money that he'd borrowed from sources connected to organized crime figures who didn't accept excuses or payment plans. These weren't the kind of people who sent strongly worded letters when payments were late. They sent messages that left permanent reminders. "You've got 1 week, pretty boy," Vinny had told him during their last phone conversation on Friday afternoon. Maverick had been sitting in his company office, surrounded by photos of successful construction projects and awards from the local business association, while a man who could destroy his life spoke calmly about breaking kneecaps. "I understand you come from money," Vinny had continued, his voice carrying the casual menace of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "Rich families usually find ways to take care of their problems. But if you can't make this right by next Friday, we start taking collateral. Maybe that pretty fiancé of yours. Maybe that construction business your daddy loves so much." The threat against Sloan had been terrifying enough, but the mention of Castellano's construction had sent Maverick into complete panic. If these people went after the business, they'd discover the missing funds, the forged invoices, the loans he'd taken out using company assets as collateral. Dad would learn that his trusted heir had been embezzling for months. Maverick had done the math obsessively over the weekend. Abuela's house was conservatively worth $800,000. Her art collection, which included several original pieces from Mexican artists who'd become internationally recognized, could easily bring in another $200,000 at auction. The jewelry she'd collected during her travels might add another $50,000. More than enough to pay off Vinny and dispose the evidence of his gambling addiction. Enough to start fresh with Sloan, maybe even take that extended honeymoon in Europe they'd been planning. Enough to replace the money he'd stolen from company accounts before Dad noticed the discrepancies. But all of this depended on inheriting Abuela's estate. And lately, Maverick had been hearing disturbing rumors about the will reading. Family lawyer Theodore Ashworth had been unusually cagey about the details, refusing to give Maverick the reassurance he desperately needed. Your grandmother had very specific ideas about how this should be handled, Ashworth had said during their last conversation. The will contains criteria that need to be evaluated carefully. Nothing is guaranteed for anyone. The lawyer's words had planted a seed of doubt that had been growing into full-blown paranoia. What if Abuela had left everything to charity? What if she'd created some complicated trust that would tie up the assets for years? What if, and this was the thought that kept him awake at night, she'd somehow discovered his financial problems and decided he wasn't responsible enough to inherit? Worse still, what if she'd left everything to me? The possibility seemed remote. After all, I was just the artistic granddaughter who worked with environmental groups and lived in a tiny apartment. I had no business experience, no understanding of real estate or investments. Surely Abuela would have recognized that I couldn't handle the responsibility of managing such valuable assets. But doubt had a way of metastasizing when someone was desperate, and Maverick had reached levels of desperation that were making him consider options he never would have contemplated when he was thinking clearly. If something happened to me before Monday's will reading, if I were somehow incapacitated or unable to participate in whatever process Abuela had established, wouldn't that automatically make him the sole inheritor? If I were hospitalized with serious injuries, confused or medicated, or simply unable to advocate for myself, wouldn't the inheritance naturally flow to the responsible older brother who'd been groomed his entire life to handle family business? The idea had started as a desperate fantasy, but had gradually evolved into something more concrete, an accident, something that would look unfortunate but inevitable, the kind of thing that happened when inexperienced people tried to help with tasks beyond their capabilities. Maverick had spent Friday night researching the kinds of injuries that would be serious enough to incapacitate someone temporarily, but not permanent enough to raise suspicions about foul play. He'd looked up statistics about furniture-moving accidents, about the kinds of trauma that resulted from heavy objects falling on people, about how family members typically reacted to such incidents. By Saturday morning, he'd convinced himself that he didn't have a choice. Vinny's deadline was approaching. The will reading was Monday, and I was the only obstacle between him and the salvation he needed. All he had to do was arrange an accident that would keep me out of that lawyer's office long enough for him to claim what should have been his anyway. Just one calculated moment of violence disguised as a tragic mistake between siblings who'd been trying to help each other. He'd already picked out the storage facility, chosen the furniture, prepared the story he'd tell our parents and the emergency responders. All he needed now was to convince me to meet him there. When he dialed my number that Saturday afternoon, his hands were shaking slightly, not from guilt, but from anticipation. He was about to solve all his problems with one carefully orchestrated accident. He just hadn't counted on Dr. Esther Blackwood knowing how to read the truth in X-ray images. Saturday afternoon, my phone buzzed with Maverick's name at exactly 2:30 p.m. His voice carried that familiar charm that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life, the same tone he'd used to convince Dad to buy him a new car after the accident, the same warmth that made teachers give him extensions on assignments he'd never completed. "Hey, Abby, got a favor to ask. I'm moving some furniture out of storage for Sloane's apartment, and I could really use an extra pair of hands. You know how Mom always says family should help family, right?" The request should have surprised me. Maverick never asked for my help with anything physical. He had friends from the construction crew who were stronger, more experienced with heavy lifting. But I'd been feeling guilty about missing Sloane's bridal shower the previous weekend due to a work deadline, and helping with their move seemed like a way to contribute to their wedding preparations. "What kind of furniture?" I asked, already mentally clearing my afternoon schedule. "Just some heavy pieces, dressers, a cabinet, nothing too crazy. Sloane's been on my case about getting this stuff moved before the wedding planning gets really intense. You know how she gets about having everything perfectly organized." I did know. Sloane Whitmore was the type of person who had been planning her wedding since middle school, complete with color-coordinated spreadsheets and vendor contracts signed months in advance. The idea that she was pressuring Maverick to handle moving logistics wasn't surprising. I'll buy you dinner afterward, Maverick added, sweetening the offer. That Thai place you like on Maple Street? We haven't hung out just the two of us in forever. That should have been another red flag. Maverick never bought me dinner, never suggested we spend time together without the rest of the family present. Our relationship had always been cordial but distant. He was the important son with important responsibilities, and I was the sister who attended family functions and stayed out of his way. But I'd been raised to be the accommodating daughter, the one who didn't cause problems or make demands. Mom had drilled into me from childhood that maintaining family harmony was more important than personal comfort. Families stick together, she'd say whenever I complained about Maverick's treatment of me. You support your brother because that's what sisters do. What time? I asked, knowing I'd already decided to help. How about 3? I'll text you the address. It's one of those storage complexes on the south side of town. Nothing fancy, but the units are big enough for furniture. After hanging up, I'd changed into old jeans and sneakers, tied my hair back in a ponytail, and grabbed a bottle of water for what I assumed would be a hot afternoon of moving boxes. I'd even stopped by the pharmacy to pick up some ibuprofen, anticipating sore muscles from lifting furniture I wasn't used to handling. The drive to the storage facility took about 20 minutes through parts of Millbrook Heights I rarely visited. Industrial buildings and empty lots stretched along poorly maintained roads, the kind of area where businesses operated quietly without much foot traffic or casual observation. Perfect for what Maverick had planned, though I didn't realize it at the time. Mountain Vista Storage sat behind a chain-link fence, rows of identical metal buildings stretching across several acres of cracked asphalt. The gate was propped open with a concrete block. Apparently, security wasn't a major concern for whatever people stored in these units. I followed the building numbers until I found Unit 47B, where Maverick's truck was already parked. He was leaning against the tailgate when I pulled up, scrolling through his phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. When he looked up and smiled, something felt off about his demeanor. He seemed nervous, distracted, like someone trying to remember lines for a performance. Thanks for coming, sis. This stuff is heavier than I thought, and Sloane's been texting me all morning about getting it moved. He held up his phone as if to show me her messages, but the screen was already dark. Another small detail that didn't quite fit. Sloane was organized and direct, not the type to send nagging texts about tasks she'd probably scheduled weeks in advance. The storage unit contained exactly what he described: bedroom furniture, boxes of dishes, the kind of household items that accumulate when two people are combining their lives. But as we walked around the space assessing what needed to be moved, I noticed that most of the furniture looked brand new, still wrapped in protective plastic. Strange items for someone to put in storage rather than using immediately. Let's start with the cabinet, Maverick said, pointing to a massive oak piece positioned against the back wall. If we can get this loaded, the rest will be easy. The cabinet was clearly an antique, solid wood, heavy brass hardware, the kind of piece that weighed significantly more than modern furniture. It sat at an angle that would require us to maneuver it around several boxes and through the narrow doorway of the unit. Not the logical place to start unless the goal was something other than efficiency. Are you sure we shouldn't do the lighter stuff first? I asked, already feeling winded just from looking at the thing. Nah, better to get the heavy lifting out of the way while we're fresh, he said. Besides, this needs to go in the truck first. It's the foundation for everything else. As we positioned ourselves on either side of the piece, I noticed Maverick's hands were shaking slightly. When I asked if he was okay, he'd blamed it on stress about work deadlines, but the explanation felt rehearsed. His whole demeanor seemed wrong, too focused, too intense for what should have been a simple favor between siblings. You grab that end, he instructed, pointing to the side closest to the back wall of the unit. I'll take this side and guide us toward the door. The positioning put me in the most awkward spot, with limited room to maneuver, and my back partially to the metal doorframe. In retrospect, I realize every detail had been calculated: the cabinet's location, our positions, even the angle we'd need to lift it. Maverick had planned this moment down to the specific physics of how much damage a 200-pound piece of furniture could do when it accidentally fell on someone. On 3, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. 1, 2. I bent down and gripped my end of the cabinet, trusting my brother to do the same. Trusting that family meant safety, that blood ties created bonds stronger than whatever personal problems might exist between us. Trusting that the golden child who'd been protected and privileged his entire life would never deliberately hurt the sister who'd spent her life staying out of his way. I was about to learn just how wrong that trust could be. The moment stretched between us like a held breath. Maverick's countdown had stopped it too, and I found myself frozen in position, gripping my end of the massive oak cabinet while waiting for the final number that would coordinate our lift. But instead of 3, Maverick's phone buzzed with a text message. He straightened up, releasing his grip on the cabinet to check the screen, leaving me bent over and holding the awkward position. "Sorry," he said, his voice carrying a distraction that felt performative. "Just need to check this. Might be the moving truck company confirming delivery times." I watched him scroll through his phone, noting how his hands had stopped shaking now that we'd paused the lifting process. The nervousness from earlier seemed to have transformed into something else, a focused calm that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The storage facility was completely silent around us. No sounds of other customers moving their belongings, no traffic noise from the road, no voices of workers or security guards. Just the distant hum of highway traffic and the metallic pinging of the storage unit roofs expanding in the afternoon heat. "Everything okay?" I asked, still maintaining my awkward grip on the cabinet. "Yeah, just Sloan being Sloan," he said, but he wasn't looking at the phone anymore. His eyes were scanning the empty complex beyond our unit, as if making sure we were truly alone. You know how she gets about schedules. The explanation felt hollow. Sloan was detail-oriented, but she wasn't the type to send urgent texts about furniture moving, especially not when she knew Maverick was actively working on the task. But I dismissed my growing unease as overthinking, the way I'd been trained to dismiss my instincts whenever they conflicted with family harmony. Maverick slipped his phone back into his pocket and returned to his position at the opposite end of the cabinet. But something had changed during the pause. His earlier nervousness had been replaced by an unsettling focus, like someone who'd just made a final decision about something important. "Ready?" he asked, and there was something different about his voice, flatter, more clinical. "Are you sure we shouldn't get someone else to help with this?" I tried one more time. "It's really heavy, and if one of us gets hurt..." "We'll be fine," he cut me off sharply. "It's just furniture, Abby. People move furniture every day without needing a whole crew." The dismissive tone was classic Maverick, the big brother who'd always treated my concerns as evidence of weakness or overcaution. But this time, it felt different, more calculated, like he was shutting down objections he'd anticipated and prepared for. I adjusted my grip on the cabinet, noting how the metal doorframe of the storage unit pressed against my back. The positioning left me with limited room to maneuver if something went wrong, if the cabinet shifted unexpectedly, or if I needed to step aside quickly. In contrast, Maverick had plenty of space behind him to back away from any problems. Another detail that should have warned me, but I was still thinking like someone who trusted her brother, still operating under the assumption that family members looked out for each other, that siblings took precautions to keep each other safe. "On 3, this time," Maverick said, and his voice carried a finality that made my stomach clench. For real. I positioned myself carefully, making sure my footing was solid on the concrete floor of the storage unit. The cabinet felt even heavier than it looked. Solid oak with brass hardware that probably added another 20 pounds to the overall weight. This wasn't the kind of furniture that people moved casually. It required planning, proper equipment, multiple people with experience in heavy lifting. But Maverick seemed determined to handle it with just the 2 of us, despite the obvious risks, despite my obvious lack of experience with this kind of work, despite the isolation of our location and the lack of anyone nearby who could help if something went wrong. "1," he said, and I tightened my grip on the cabinet handles. 2, and I bent my knees, preparing to lift with my legs rather than my back, the way I'd seen movers do on television. I waited for 3, for the coordinated effort that would get this heavy piece of furniture safely into his truck so we could move on to easier items. I waited for my brother to demonstrate the same care for my safety that I'd always assumed came automatically with family relationships. Instead, what came next would shatter that assumption forever and teach me that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need protection from most. 3. I lifted my end of the cabinet as we'd coordinated, my muscles straining against the unexpected weight. The piece rose smoothly for exactly 2 seconds until Maverick suddenly released his grip entirely. 200 pounds of solid oak cabinet crashed down with devastating force. The sharp corner drove directly into my ribcage like a battering ram, crushing me backward against the unforgiving metal doorframe of the storage unit. The impact was so violent, so precisely targeted, that for a moment my brain couldn't process what had happened. The crack was audible, not the wood splintering, but something inside my chest breaking with a sound like dry kindling snapping in half. Pain exploded through my torso with an intensity that whited out my vision, so overwhelming that I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but collapse as the cabinet's weight pinned me against the metal frame. "Oops," Maverick said, his voice completely calm, clinical. "Butterfingers." Even through the agony that was consuming every nerve in my body, that single word penetrated my consciousness like ice water. There was no panic in his voice, no shock, no concern, just a casual dismissal of what should have been a catastrophic accident between siblings. As he lifted the cabinet off me with movements that seemed almost leisurely, Maverick leaned down so his face was inches from mine. His voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "Maybe now you'll think twice about competing with me for what's mine, little sister." The words hit me harder than the cabinet had. This hadn't been an accident. This hadn't been clumsiness or bad coordination or the inevitable result of 2 inexperienced people trying to move furniture that was too heavy for them. Maverick had deliberately crushed my ribs with calculated precision, and he wanted me to know it. "Some accidents," he continued, in that same deadly whisper, "are more preventable than others." I lay gasping on the concrete floor of the storage unit, each attempted breath sending lightning bolts of agony through my chest. The taste of blood filled my mouth. I must have bitten my tongue when I hit the ground. My vision kept going in and out of focus, dark spots dancing at the edges as my body struggled to cope with the trauma. But even through the physical shock, my mind was racing to process what had just happened. My brother, the golden child, the family favorite, the man our parents trusted with their business legacy, had just tried to seriously injure me. Not in a moment of anger or passion, but with cold calculation. He'd planned this moment, chosen this location, positioned that cabinet specifically to cause maximum damage. Maverick was already pulling out his phone, his movements smooth and practiced, like someone following a script he'd rehearsed. His voice transformed instantly from the cold whisper he'd used with me to the panicked concern of a brother whose sister had just been hurt in a terrible accident. "Mom, we need an ambulance. Abby got hurt helping me move furniture." The performance was flawless. His voice cracked with exactly the right amount of worry, carried exactly the right level of urgency without being hysterical. He sounded like someone who was trying to stay calm in a crisis while being devastated by guilt over an accident he couldn't have prevented. "She lost her grip on a cabinet and it fell on her," he continued, pacing around the storage unit while staying carefully out of my line of sight. "I think she might have broken some ribs. Yeah, she's conscious, but she's in a lot of pain." As I listened to him fabricate this version of events, I realized with growing horror that this had been planned down to the smallest detail. He already had the story ready, complete with explanations for why I would have lost my grip, why the accident was ultimately my fault for being too weak to handle furniture that was obviously beyond my capabilities. The sirens were already audible in the distance when Maverick crouched down beside me again, his public mask of concern sliding over his features like a costume. But his eyes remained cold, calculating, satisfied with the precision of what he'd accomplished. "Just remember," he murmured, his voice barely audible beneath the approaching emergency vehicles, "accidents happen when people don't know their place." The message was clear. If I survived this, if I recovered enough to challenge him for Abuela's inheritance, he was prepared to arrange another accident, more permanent next time. The golden child had revealed himself to be something much darker, a man willing to destroy his own sister to protect his lies. As the paramedics rushed into the storage unit and Maverick launched into his rehearsed explanation of my clumsiness, I closed my eyes and tried to focus on breathing through the pain. But beneath the physical agony, a different kind of awareness was growing. My brother had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd assumed that injuring me would make me weak, compliant, afraid to challenge him. Instead, he'd revealed exactly who he really was, and that knowledge would become the weapon I'd eventually use to destroy him completely. The ambulance arrived within 12 minutes, and Maverick's transformation was complete by the time the paramedics rushed through the gate of the storage facility. Gone was any trace of the cold, calculating man who'd whispered threats in my ear. In his place stood the concerned older brother, pacing frantically while staying just close enough to seem involved, but far enough away to avoid interfering with medical treatment. "Thank God you're here," he said to the lead paramedic, a woman named Sarah whose name tag caught the afternoon sunlight. "I've been so worried. She's been in and out of consciousness since it happened." That was a lie. I'd been fully conscious the entire time, fighting to breathe through the agony in my chest while listening to him rehearse his story during phone calls to our parents. But the way he said it, with exactly the right amount of shaky relief, made it sound completely believable. "Can you tell me what happened?" Sarah asked, while her partner began checking my vital signs and assessing my injuries. Maverick launched into his prepared narrative with the skill of someone who'd spent his entire life talking his way out of trouble. "We were moving furniture from my fiancé's apartment. Abby insisted she could handle the heavy stuff. You know how she is, always trying to prove she's stronger than she looks." The characterization was perfect because it contained just enough truth to be convincing. I had always been independent, sometimes to a fault. I did occasionally take on tasks that were beyond my physical capabilities out of stubbornness or pride. These were traits our family knew well, traits that made Maverick's version of events seem entirely plausible. "She was lifting her end of this big oak cabinet," he continued, gesturing toward the massive piece of furniture that was now positioned innocuously against the storage unit wall. "I guess the weight was too much for her. She lost her grip and tried to catch it when it started falling, but it came down right on her ribs." Sarah nodded while taking notes, but I caught something in her expression, a flicker of professional skepticism that gave me the first spark of hope I'd felt since this nightmare began. Paramedics saw a lot of accidents, and they probably developed instincts about which stories added up and which ones didn't. "Were you able to maintain your grip?" she asked Maverick directly. "Yeah, but it happened so fast," he said. "I should have insisted we wait for more help. I should have known she couldn't handle something that heavy. This is all my fault for not being more careful." The self-blame was a masterful touch. It made him sound responsible and caring, while simultaneously reinforcing the narrative that I'd been the weak link in our furniture moving operation. Classic Maverick manipulation, using apparent accountability to actually shift blame away from himself. As the paramedics worked to stabilize me for transport, Maverick kept up a steady stream of worried commentary that painted him as the devoted brother who'd do anything to help his clumsy sister. He mentioned my job designing logos for little environmental groups, subtly emphasizing my lack of experience with physical labor. He referenced my small apartment and modest lifestyle, implying that I wasn't used to handling expensive, heavy furniture. Every detail was calculated to support his version of events while making me seem like someone whose own limitations had caused this accident. He was building a narrative that would protect him not just with the paramedics, but with our parents, with the hospital staff, with anyone who might question what had really happened in that storage unit. But what Maverick didn't know was that his performance was being observed by more than just emergency responders. Sarah's partner, a veteran EMT named Carlos, had been taking photos of the scene as part of standard documentation procedures. The position of the cabinet, the lack of any other equipment that might have helped with heavy lifting, the isolation of the location, all of it was being recorded as evidence. More importantly, they were both noting inconsistencies in Maverick's story that he was too confident to notice. The cabinet was positioned against the wall in a way that suggested it had been moved after my injury, not dropped during a failed lifting attempt. My injuries were localized to one side of my rib cage, consistent with a targeted impact rather than being crushed under a falling object. Small details that might not mean anything to a casual observer, but which trained professionals recognized as red flags worth documenting. The same kind of details that would later catch the attention of Dr. Esther Blackwood when she reviewed my x-rays and realized that everything about this accident was wrong. As they loaded me onto the stretcher and prepared for transport to Millbrook General, Maverick leaned down one final time, ostensibly to offer comfort, but actually to deliver another subtle threat. "Don't worry, sis," he said, his voice loud enough for the paramedics to hear, but his eyes conveying a different message entirely. "Everything's going to be fine. You just need to rest and focus on getting better." The subtext was clear. Keep quiet, stick to his story, and don't cause problems that might complicate his carefully constructed narrative. He was still operating under the assumption that injuring me had put him in control of the situation. He had no idea that his accident was about to trigger an investigation that would expose every lie he'd ever told and destroy everything he'd spent his life building. Mom and Dad arrived at Millbrook General Medical Center before the ambulance, having broken every speed limit between our house and the hospital. They rushed into the emergency bay with expressions of panic that immediately shifted into something more calculated when they saw the medical staff surrounding my stretcher. "Our daughter had an accident," Dad announced to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying the same authority he used when addressing construction crews or city planning committees. "She was helping her brother move furniture and got hurt. These things happen when people try to lift more than they can handle." The immediate framing of the incident as an inevitable result of my own limitations wasn't accidental. Dad had built Castellano's construction by managing problems before they became crises, and he was already treating my injury as a potential threat to our family's reputation that needed to be contained. Mom went straight into caretaker performance mode, fussing over me while simultaneously reinforcing Maverick's story to every nurse, orderly, and doctor who came within range. "Oh, mija, you should have waited for your father to help. You know you're not built for heavy lifting like your brother." Her concern sounded genuine. Mom had always been protective of me in her own way, but there was something performative about her distress. She was playing the role of the worried mother while carefully establishing the narrative that would protect Maverick from any scrutiny. "She insisted she could handle it," Maverick added, appearing at the foot of my hospital bed with his voice heavy with guilt that sounded completely authentic. I should have said no, but you know how Abby gets when she wants to prove herself. The characterization was perfect because it played into every family dynamic that had shaped my entire childhood. I was the stubborn daughter who didn't know her limitations. Maverick was the patient big brother who indulged my independence even when he knew better. Our parents were the reasonable adults who understood that accidents happened when children didn't listen to guidance. A nurse approached with paperwork, and I watched my family close ranks around her like a well-rehearsed unit. Dad provided insurance information while explaining that I worked for small nonprofits and lived alone, subtly establishing that I wasn't used to handling expensive or heavy items. Mom described my artistic temperament and tendency to take on projects beyond my capabilities. Maverick contributed details about how he'd tried to convince me to wait for help, how he'd suggested using professional movers, how he'd been worried about exactly this kind of accident. Every word was calculated to paint him as the responsible family member who'd done everything possible to prevent what had ultimately become inevitable. The medical team exchanged glances, and I caught something in the head nurse's expression, a flicker of skepticism that made me realize not everyone was buying our family's coordinated story. Emergency room staff probably saw a lot of accidents that weren't quite what families claimed them to be. But my parents were already overwhelming the medical team with their concern and explanations, creating a wall of family unity that made questioning their version of events seem inappropriate or unnecessarily suspicious. They were skilled at managing narratives, at presenting a united front that discouraged deeper investigation. "The important thing is that she's going to be okay," Dad said to Dr. Reeves when she approached to discuss my condition. "We're a close family. We take care of each other. Sometimes these things just happen, and you deal with them together." The emphasis on family loyalty and togetherness wasn't accidental. Dad was establishing that any attempts to interview family members separately or question our story would be met with resistance. We were presenting ourselves as a unified unit with a consistent version of events, and any medical professional who suggested otherwise would be painted as someone trying to create problems where none existed. Mom positioned herself as my primary advocate, asking detailed questions about my treatment and prognosis while making it clear that all information should be shared with the entire family. "We don't keep secrets from each other," she said firmly. "What affects one of us affects all of us." The message was subtle but clear. If medical staff had concerns about my injuries or wanted to speak with me privately, they'd have to go through my family first. And my family was already committed to a version of events that protected Maverick from any consequences. As I lay on the hospital bed, still fighting waves of pain that made it difficult to speak clearly, I watched my parents and brother coordinate their damage control efforts with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Maybe not for something this serious, but certainly for smaller crises that had threatened Maverick's reputation over the years. They were good at it, convincing, united. Everything about their behavior suggested a loving family rallying around a daughter who'd made a mistake and gotten hurt as a result. The perfect cover for what had actually been a calculated assault designed to incapacitate me before Monday's will reading. But what none of them knew was that their performance was being observed by medical professionals who were trained to recognize the patterns of family abuse. And those professionals were about to make phone calls that would shatter our family's carefully constructed lies and expose the truth that my parents were so desperately trying to hide. Dr. Nalani Reeves was in her early 40s, with tired eyes that suggested she'd seen enough human suffering to develop instincts about which family stories were genuine and which ones were carefully rehearsed performances. She examined me with methodical precision while my family hovered nearby, their collective narrative filling the small trauma room like smoke. "Can you describe exactly how this happened?" Dr. Reeves asked me directly. Her dark eyes focused on my face rather than my parents or Maverick. Before I could gather enough breath to answer, Maverick jumped in with his practiced explanation. She was lifting her end of an oak cabinet, and I guess the weight was too much. She lost her grip, and it came down on her when she tried to catch it. "I'm asking your sister," Dr. Reeves said firmly, never breaking eye contact with me. Her voice carried the authority of someone who dealt with interfering family members before. "Abigail, can you tell me in your own words what you remember?" The room went quiet in a way that felt charged with tension. I could feel my family's collective pressure, their unspoken demand that I stick to the script they'd already established. Maverick's earlier threats echoed in my mind, the promise that accidents could be more permanent if I didn't know my place. But there was something in Dr. Reeves' expression that made me want to tell her everything, a steadiness that suggested she'd heard worse stories than mine and hadn't been broken by them, a professional competence that made me believe she might actually be able to help me. I was helping move furniture," I managed to whisper through the pain that made every breath feel like swallowing glass. "The cabinet was heavy. It fell." The words came out exactly as my family wanted them to, but Dr. Reeves' expression suggested she wasn't satisfied with my answer. There was something in her eyes that told me she recognized the difference between a complete truth and a careful partial admission. "Were you positioned underneath the cabinet when it fell?" she asked, continuing to focus on me despite my family's obvious discomfort with her direct questioning. "She was trying to catch it," Dad interjected, his voice carrying a note of impatience. "You know how it is with kids. They don't think about their safety when something expensive is about to get damaged." Dr. Reeves turned toward Dad with an expression that could have frozen water. Sir, I need to hear from the patient directly. These details are important for understanding the nature of her injuries. The rebuke was polite but unmistakable, and I watched Dad's face redden with the kind of anger he usually reserved for construction workers who questioned his authority. He wasn't used to being dismissed by anyone, especially not by someone he probably saw as just another employee whose job was to fix problems rather than ask inconvenient questions. The cabinet fell on my ribs, I said quietly, sticking to the most basic facts while avoiding the details that would expose Maverick's lies. It was heavier than I expected. Dr. Reeves nodded, but I could see her mind working behind her professional calm. She was noting things: the way my family answered questions I hadn't been asked, the way they positioned themselves to monitor my responses, the way their story felt too polished for people who just experienced a traumatic accident. "We're going to need x-rays to see the extent of the damage," she said, making notes on her clipboard. "Sometimes with rib injuries, there can be complications, damage to internal organs, internal bleeding, punctured lungs. We'll need to be thorough in our examination." The mention of a thorough examination made Mom shift uncomfortably. Is all of that really necessary? It was just a furniture accident. These things happen in families. "Every serious injury requires proper evaluation," Dr. Reeves replied, her tone suggesting this wasn't a negotiable point. "We need to rule out complications that might not be immediately apparent." She turned back to me, and for a moment, our eyes met in a way that felt like she was trying to communicate something beyond her professional duties. "Abigail, is there anything else you think I should know about what happened? Anything that might help me understand your injuries better?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. She was giving me an opening to tell her the truth, to explain that this hadn't been an accident, to ask for the help I desperately needed. But Maverick was standing right behind her, and his presence felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest alongside the pain from my broken ribs. The memory of his whispered threats was too fresh, too specific. Some accidents are more preventable than others. Just the cabinet," I whispered, hating myself for the cowardice, but too afraid of what might happen if I contradicted my family's story. "It was an accident." Dr. Reeves studied my face for another long moment, and I had the distinct impression that she didn't believe me. But she also seemed to understand that pushing harder right now, with my entire family present and listening to every word, wouldn't accomplish anything except potentially putting me in more danger. "All right," she said finally, "let's get those x-rays and see what we're dealing with." As she prepared to leave the trauma room, Dr. Reeves made one final note on her clipboard, something that seemed longer and more detailed than a simple medical observation. I couldn't see what she'd written, but the way she underlined certain words suggested she was documenting more than just my injuries. What I didn't know was that she was already planning to send my x-rays to Dr. Esther Blackwood, the hospital's head radiologist and one of the leading experts in the region on trauma patterns that suggested family violence. Dr. Reeves had learned to trust her instincts about which accidents weren't really accidents at all. And her instincts were screaming that everything about my family's story was wrong. While I was taken for x-rays, my family gathered in the waiting room for what I later learned was a strategy session. When I returned to the trauma room on a wheelchair, their energy had shifted to something more coordinated, more desperate. The casual concern from earlier had been replaced by a focused intensity that made the air feel thick with unspoken pressure. "The doctor says you might need surgery if there's internal damage," Mom said, gripping my hand with fingers that trembled slightly. Her voice carried a forced brightness that didn't match the worry lines around her eyes. "But honey, these things happen in families. Accidents. We don't need to make this into something bigger than it is." The emphasis on the word accidents felt deliberate, like she was reminding me of the official story we were all supposed to stick to. Her grip on my hand tightened almost imperceptibly, a physical reminder that my answers mattered to more than just my own recovery. Dad positioned himself at the foot of my hospital bed, his voice dropping to the tone he used for serious business discussions, the same voice he employed when explaining to construction crews that certain shortcuts needed to be taken to meet deadlines, regardless of what safety inspectors might prefer to see. "Your brother feels terrible about what happened," he said, his eyes never quite meeting mine directly. "He's been beating himself up since the accident. You know how family gossip spreads in this town. People might get the wrong idea if they hear too many details about family members getting hurt." The implication was clear without being stated outright. Millbrook Heights was a small community where reputations mattered, where successful families like ours were expected to maintain certain appearances. Any suggestion that violence might have occurred within the Castellanos family would damage not just Maverick's standing, but Dad's business relationships and Mom's social connections. "What Dad's saying," Mom continued smoothly, tag-teaming the conversation with the kind of coordination that suggested they'd discussed this approach thoroughly, "is that sometimes it's better to keep family matters private. Maverick's got his engagement to Sloan coming up, the business reputation to think about. We all need to be smart about how we handle this." Maverick sat in the corner chair, his head buried in his hands, the picture of guilt-ridden remorse. He looked like someone who was genuinely devastated by the consequences of his carelessness, someone whose anguish over hurting his sister was almost too painful to witness. "I'm so sorry, Abby," he said without looking up, his voice thick with what sounded like genuine emotion. "If I'd been more careful, if I'd insisted on waiting for Dad to help, this is all my fault." The performance was so convincing that for a moment I almost believed him myself, almost forgot the cold calculation in his voice when he'd whispered threats in my ear, almost dismissed the deliberate way he'd released his grip on that cabinet. The guilt in his voice sounded so real that part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault. But I remembered the crack of my ribs breaking, remembered the satisfaction in his eyes when he leaned down to make sure I understood this had been intentional. The man sitting in that corner chair might look like someone destroyed by guilt, but I knew he was actually someone celebrating the success of his plan. "The important thing is that everyone learns from this," Dad continued, his tone suggesting this was a teachable moment rather than a potential crime scene. "Maverick's learned not to let you help with heavy lifting. You've learned not to insist on doing things that are beyond your capabilities. We've all learned to be more careful about family safety." The framing was masterful. He was turning my assault into a learning experience that would make our family stronger and safer. By accepting responsibility for being too weak to handle furniture moving, I would be contributing to our collective growth rather than creating problems that might require outside intervention. Mom leaned closer, her voice dropping to the intimate tone she'd used when I was a child and needed comfort after nightmares or disappointments. "You know we love you, mija. You're our baby girl, and we'd do anything to protect you. But sometimes protecting you means protecting the whole family from unnecessary scrutiny." The message was wrapped in maternal love, but the meaning was unmistakable. If I contradicted their story, if I suggested that Maverick had hurt me deliberately, I would be betraying not just him, but our entire family structure. I would be choosing outside authorities over family loyalty, strangers over the people who'd raised and loved me. "Think about Abuela," Dad added quietly, playing what he probably considered his strongest card. "She always said family comes first, that we take care of our own problems without involving outsiders. She wouldn't want to see us torn apart by misunderstandings about an accident." Using Abuela's memory to pressure me into silence felt like a violation almost as serious as Maverick's physical assault. Our grandmother had valued family loyalty, but she'd also valued truth and integrity. She would never have asked me to protect someone who'd deliberately hurt me, regardless of blood relationships. But my family didn't know about Abuela's real will, didn't know that she'd already chosen me over Maverick because she'd recognized something in his character that they'd refused to see. They were asking me to sacrifice my truth to protect a man who'd proven himself willing to seriously injure his own sister for money. As I lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by people who claimed to love me while pressuring me to hide the evidence of my brother's violence, I realized that my family's loyalty had always been conditional. They'd protect me as long as it didn't threaten their more important relationships. They'd support me as long as I didn't cause problems for the people who really mattered. Maverick had counted on that dynamic when he'd planned his assault. He'd assumed that even if I suspected the truth, I'd never risk family harmony by speaking it aloud. He was about to learn that he'd miscalculated badly. Because while my family was pressuring me to stay quiet, medical professionals were making phone calls that would expose every lie they'd ever told. What my family didn't know was that Dr. Esther Blackwood, head of radiology at Millbrook General, had been called in to review my X-ray films. At 52, she'd spent the last 15 years documenting abuse patterns for court cases and had developed an almost supernatural ability to read violence in the angles and fractures that appeared on her computer screens. Dr. Blackwood studied my ribs with the focused intensity of someone examining evidence at a crime scene. The images glowed against the dark background of her radiology office, each bone clearly defined in shades of gray and white that told a story my family desperately wanted to keep hidden. What she saw made her lean back in her chair and reach for her phone. The fracture pattern was wrong, completely, unmistakably wrong for the kind of accident my family had described. If I'd been crushed under a falling cabinet while trying to catch it, the damage would have been distributed across multiple ribs, showing the chaotic trauma of someone being pinned under a heavy object. Instead, my X-rays showed 3 cleanly broken ribs in a concentrated area, with fracture angles that indicated a single, focused impact. The kind of trauma that occurred when something heavy was driven into a specific location with considerable force, not when someone was accidentally crushed under falling furniture. This wasn't a furniture accident, Dr. Blackwood murmured to herself, tracing the fracture lines with her finger on the computer screen. Someone did this. She'd seen similar patterns in domestic violence cases, injuries that families tried to explain as accidents, but which told a different story under professional scrutiny. The precision of the damage, the concentrated force required to create these specific fractures, the way the breaks aligned with what would happen if someone had used a heavy object as a weapon. Dr. Blackwood picked up her phone and dialed Dr. Reeves' direct extension. "Nalani, I need you to look at the Castellanos films with me, now." When Dr. Reeves arrived in the radiology department 5 minutes later, Dr. Blackwood was already pulling up comparison images on her second monitor, X-rays from previous cases where heavy objects had been used to assault family members. "Look at this fracture pattern," Dr. Blackwood said, pointing to my ribs on the screen. "See how clean these breaks are? How concentrated the damage is to this specific area?" Dr. Reeves studied the images, her expression growing darker as she recognized what her colleague was showing her. "This is consistent with targeted impact, not accidental crushing." "Exactly, and look at the angle of these fractures," Dr. Blackwood continued, highlighting specific areas on the X-ray. "This suggests the victim was positioned against something solid, probably that metal door frame the family mentioned, when the impact occurred. Someone used that cabinet like a battering ram." The 2 doctors spent several minutes reviewing the images, comparing them to textbook examples of assault injuries and accidental trauma. Every detail supported the same conclusion. I hadn't been hurt in a furniture-moving accident. I'd been deliberately attacked by someone who'd known exactly how to position me for maximum damage. "The family's story doesn't match the medical evidence at all," Dr. Reeves said quietly. "They're lying about what happened to her." Dr. Blackwood nodded grimly. "And they're pressuring her to stick to their version of events, classic pattern for family violence situations where the perpetrator has support from other family members." She began taking screenshots of the X-rays from multiple angles, creating an official record that would be admissible in court proceedings. Each image was carefully labeled and dated, building a comprehensive documentation of evidence that contradicted everything my family had claimed. "We need to report this," Dr. Blackwood said, her voice carrying the weight of professional obligation. "Hospital policy requires us to contact authorities when we suspect family violence, regardless of what the patient or family claims happened." Dr. Reeves agreed, but she also understood the delicate nature of the situation. The patient is afraid to contradict her family's story. If we push too hard, too fast, we might put her in more danger. "Which is exactly why we need to involve professionals who are trained to handle these situations," Dr. Blackwood replied. "Social services, police, people who know how to protect victims while investigating perpetrators." She began making phone calls, first to hospital administration to report suspected family violence, then to the local police department's domestic abuse unit, finally to social services to request an immediate investigation. Each call was documented, each conversation recorded as part of the hospital's legal obligation to protect patients from further harm. What neither doctor knew was that their phone calls were about to trigger a chain of events that would destroy my family's carefully constructed lies and expose Maverick's true nature to everyone who'd spent years protecting him. The medical evidence they'd discovered would become the foundation for criminal charges that would send my brother to prison and reveal the depth of his desperation. But more than that, their willingness to speak up for a patient who couldn't speak up for herself would give me the courage to eventually tell my own truth. Sometimes the most important advocates are strangers who choose to act on professional principles rather than family loyalty. Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Reeves had just become the allies I didn't know I needed, and their expertise would soon prove more powerful than my family's lies. Dr. Blackwood made a decision that would change everything. She contacted hospital administration and requested an immediate consultation with the Medical Ethics Board, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd testified in dozens of court cases about family violence patterns. "We have a patient presenting with injuries that are completely inconsistent with the family's explanation," she reported to Dr. Patricia Hayes, the hospital's chief medical officer. "The fracture pattern indicates deliberate assault, not accidental trauma. The family is coordinating their story and pressuring the patient to remain silent." Within 30 minutes, the hospital's legal team had reviewed the case and reached the same conclusion that Dr. Blackwood had documented in her radiological report. They had a legal and ethical duty to report suspected abuse, regardless of family objections or patient reluctance to cooperate. "Document everything," Dr. Hayes instructed. "Every conversation, every medical finding, every interaction with family members. If this goes to court, and it probably will, we need a complete record that shows we followed proper protocols." Dr. Blackwood began photographing my x-rays from multiple angles, creating an official archive that would be admissible in criminal proceedings. She compared the images to reference materials, documenting exactly why the fracture patterns indicated intentional violence rather than accidental injury. But more importantly, she began reaching out to her network of colleagues who specialized in forensic medicine and domestic violence documentation. Dr. Blackwood had spent years building relationships with law enforcement, social workers, and legal professionals who understood that medical evidence often provided the most reliable testimony in family violence cases. "I'm sending you x-rays from a suspected assault case," she told Detective Maria Hayes during their phone conversation. "24-year-old female, family claims furniture moving accident, but the fracture patterns tell a different story entirely." Detective Hayes had worked with Dr. Blackwood on previous cases and trusted her expertise completely. "What are we looking at?" 3 broken ribs with fracture angles consistent with targeted impact against a solid surface. Someone used a heavy object to deliberately injure this patient, then positioned the scene to look like an accident. The family is already coordinating their story to protect the perpetrator. The detective's response was immediate and decisive. "We'll need to interview all family members separately, examine the scene where the alleged accident occurred, and document any physical evidence before it can be altered or destroyed." Dr. Blackwood felt a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal sadness as she watched the investigation machinery begin to activate. Satisfaction because she'd seen too many abuse victims fall through the cracks when medical professionals failed to speak up. Sadness because exposing family violence always meant destroying the illusion of safety that victims had built around their relationships with people who claimed to love them. Dr. Reeves joined the conversation as they finalized the documentation process. "The patient is terrified of contradicting her family's story, classic signs of intimidation and learned helplessness. When I tried to question her directly, the entire family intervened to prevent private conversation." "Which tells us everything we need to know about the power dynamics in that family," Detective Hayes replied. "The perpetrator has support from other family members who are willing to help cover up his violence. That makes the victim even more vulnerable and less likely to report abuse voluntarily." The three women, doctor, radiologist, and detective, represented different aspects of a system designed to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. Each brought specialized expertise that complemented the others: medical evidence, legal authority, and investigative experience with family violence cases. "What's our timeline?" Dr. Blackwood asked, understanding that acting quickly would be crucial for both protecting me from further harm and preserving evidence before my family could alter their story or coach me more extensively. "I'll have officers at the hospital within 2 hours," Detective Hayes confirmed. "We'll start with separate interviews of family members, then examine the storage facility where the incident allegedly occurred. The medical evidence you've documented gives us probable cause to treat this as a criminal investigation rather than a family matter." As the phone call ended, Dr. Blackwood reflected on how many times she'd been in similar situations: medical professionals discovering evidence of violence that families desperately wanted to hide. The pattern was always the same: initial denial, coordinated stories, pressure on victims to maintain silence, and underlying threats about what would happen if anyone spoke the truth. But this case felt different, more calculated than the typical domestic violence situation she'd encountered. The precision of my injuries, the elaborate staging of the accident scene, the sophisticated coordination of my family's story, all of it suggested someone who's planned this assault carefully, rather than acting in a moment of rage or desperation. What Dr. Blackwood didn't know was that Maverick's gambling debts and the approaching inheritance deadline had created exactly the kind of pressure that transformed entitled men into dangerous predators. She didn't know about Abuela's real will, or the money Maverick owed to violent criminals, or the carefully researched plan he developed to incapacitate me before Monday's lawyer meeting. But she didn't need to know the specifics to recognize that someone had tried to seriously harm me and that my family was helping him escape consequences. The medical evidence was clear, the legal obligations were unambiguous, and the professional relationships she'd built over 15 years were about to be activated in defense of a patient who couldn't defend herself. Sometimes, the most important thing medical professionals can do is refuse to be complicit in the lies that families tell to protect their most dangerous members.
Monday morning brought Detective Maria Hayes and Child Protective Services investigator Marcus Rodriguez to our house on Elm Street at exactly 8:30 a.m. They'd received the hospital's formal report about suspected family violence, complete with Dr. Blackwood's detailed analysis of my x-rays and documented inconsistencies in our family's coordinated story. Dad opened the door in his work clothes, coffee mug in hand, completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. His face shifted from mild curiosity to alarm as he registered the official badges and serious expressions of the two people standing on our front porch. "Mr. Roman Castellanos?" Detective Hayes asked, showing her credentials. "We're here about the incident involving your daughter Abigail on Saturday afternoon. We have some questions about what happened at the storage facility." I watched from the top of the stairs, still wearing the hospital-issued sling that supported my injured ribs, as my family's carefully constructed world began to crack apart. The confident authority Dad usually projected wavered as he faced professionals who weren't impressed by his local business reputation or construction company success. "I don't understand," he said, his voice already taking on the defensive tone he used when city inspectors questioned his building permits. "Abby had an accident helping her brother. Why would police be involved in a family matter?" "Because medical experts have determined that her injuries are inconsistent with the story your family provided to hospital staff," Rodriguez explained, his clipboard already filled with notes from their preliminary investigation. "We need to speak with each family member separately about what happened Saturday afternoon." The word "separately" hit my parents like a physical blow. Their entire strategy had been built around presenting a united front, coordinating their responses, making sure no one contradicted the official narrative they'd established. The idea of being questioned individually, without the ability to monitor each other's answers, clearly terrified them. Mom appeared from the kitchen, her face already shifting into damage control mode. "There must be some kind of misunderstanding. Our daughter had an accident. These things happen when people try to lift furniture that's too heavy for them."
Ma'am, we're not here to debate what happened, Detective Hayes said firmly. We're here to investigate a potential assault case based on medical evidence that contradicts your family's explanation. Everyone who was present during the incident needs to be interviewed. The mention of assault charges made Dad's coffee mug tremble in his hands. Up until this moment, he'd probably believed that their coordinated story would be enough to handle any questions about my injuries. The realization that professionals had examined physical evidence and found it inconsistent with their lies was clearly devastating. Maverick emerged from his room looking like someone who'd been expecting this moment but hoping it would never come. The confident golden child was gone, replaced by someone whose hands shook as he tried to button his shirt properly. His face had the pale, sweaty appearance of someone whose carefully constructed lies were about to be exposed under professional scrutiny. Can we call our lawyer? Mom asked, her voice small and uncertain. You're certainly entitled to legal representation, Rodriguez replied, but I should inform you that requesting lawyers before answering basic questions about your daughter's injuries might raise additional concerns about your family's cooperation with this investigation. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. They could lawyer up, but doing so would signal that they had something to hide, something that required legal protection rather than simple truth-telling. It would transform this from a routine follow-up investigation into something more serious and public. Where would you like to conduct these interviews? Detective Hayes asked, making it clear that cooperation wasn't optional. Dad looked around our living room, the same space where family meetings had always been held, where decisions had always been made collectively, where his authority had never been questioned by outside forces. Now it was about to become a crime scene investigation area where his carefully protected son might be exposed as someone who deliberately injured his own sister. Here is fine, he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the commanding presence he used in business situations. But I want to go first. I want to make sure you understand that we're a good family, that we take care of each other, that whatever happened was just an unfortunate accident. Detective Hayes exchanged a glance with Rodriguez, and I could see them recognizing the same pattern Dr. Blackwood had identified in the hospital. The family patriarch trying to control the narrative, establish the framework, make sure his version of events was heard before anyone could contradict it. We'll start with whoever was present during the incident, she said diplomatically. Mr. Maverick Castellanos, since you were the only other person at the storage facility, we'll need to speak with you first. The color drained from Maverick's face completely. He'd been counting on Dad going first, on having the family's most authoritative figure establish the official story before he had to answer any direct questions. Being forced to speak first, without the benefit of hearing how his parents handled the investigators, clearly terrified him. I might want to call someone, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That's your right, Detective Hayes replied. But I should mention that the medical evidence is quite clear about what happened to your sister. Sometimes cooperation and honesty work better than legal maneuvering. As I watched my brother struggle with the decision of whether to confess or continue lying, I realized that his assault on me had set in motion a chain of events he'd never anticipated. He'd planned to incapacitate me before Monday's will reading, but instead, he'd created medical evidence that would destroy his life completely. The separate interviews revealed the cracks in our family's story within the first hour. Detective Hayes began with Maverick in our living room, while Rodriguez spoke with Dad in the kitchen, and a second officer questioned Mom in the dining room. The careful coordination they'd maintained at the hospital fell apart the moment they couldn't monitor each other's responses. Maverick's version of events changed 3 times during his 30-minute interview. First, he claimed I'd lost my grip while lifting the cabinet. Then, when Detective Hayes pointed out that the medical evidence didn't support that explanation, he revised his story to say the cabinet had shifted unexpectedly. Finally, when pressed about the specific positioning and angle of impact, he broke down completely. I don't know exactly what happened, he sobbed, his golden child facade crumbling under professional scrutiny. Everything happened so fast. Maybe I wasn't holding my end properly. Maybe I let go without realizing it. I just know my sister got hurt and it's killing me. The performance might have been convincing to someone who didn't know him, But Detective Hayes had been studying his body language and noting the inconsistencies in his timeline. She'd also reviewed the photographs that the paramedics had taken at the scene, which showed the cabinet positioned against the storage unit wall in a way that contradicted his explanation of how it had fallen. Dad's interview in the kitchen was equally revealing. When asked about Maverick's gambling habits or financial situation, he became defensive and evasive. "My son is responsible with money. He's being groomed to take over our business. We don't have those kinds of problems in our family." But when Rodriguez asked specific questions about recent changes in Maverick's behavior, about any unusual stress or pressures he might have been experiencing, Dad's answers revealed more than he intended. Yes, Maverick had been working longer hours lately. Yes, he'd seemed distracted during recent family dinners. Yes, there had been some phone calls from people Dad didn't recognize. Business calls, Dad insisted. Contractors, suppliers, clients, nothing unusual for someone in construction. Mom's interview revealed the most damaging information. When asked about my relationship with Maverick, she inadvertently disclosed years of family dynamics that painted a picture of golden child favoritism and systematic dismissal of my concerns or needs. "Abby's always been sensitive," she explained to the officer. "She takes things too personally, reads too much into situations. Maverick's always been patient with her, even when she causes problems." "What kind of problems?" the officer asked. "Oh, you know how siblings can be. Jealousy, competition, misunderstandings about family priorities. Abby sometimes feels overlooked because Maverick's more involved in the business side of things." The picture that emerged from her responses was of a family where one child's needs consistently took precedence over the others, where concerns about favoritism were dismissed as jealousy, and where questioning the golden child's behavior was treated as a character flaw in the questioner. When the three investigators reconvened to compare notes, the pattern was clear. The family's story had multiple inconsistencies, their defensive responses suggested they were hiding information, and their description of family dynamics indicated exactly the kind of environment where abuse could occur and be covered up. But the most damaging revelation came when Detective Hayes asked Rodriguez what he discovered about the storage facility. "I drove out there this morning before coming here," he said, "talked to the facility manager, reviewed their security footage. And the cabinet was moved after the incident. The position it's in now doesn't match where the paramedics found it when they arrived. Someone repositioned it to support their story about how it fell." The evidence of scene tampering was devastating to my family's credibility. It proved that someone had deliberately altered physical evidence to support their false narrative, which transformed this from a potential accident with inconsistent explanations into a clear case of assault with attempted cover-up. "There's more," Rodriguez continued. "The facility manager mentioned that Maverick had rented that storage unit specifically for Saturday afternoon. He'd called Friday morning asking about availability, paid for one day in cash, and specified that he needed a unit in the most isolated section of the complex." Detective Hayes felt the final pieces clicking into place. This wasn't a spontaneous decision to move furniture. This was premeditated assault with a carefully chosen location designed to avoid witnesses. The investigation was no longer about determining whether an accident had occurred. It was about building a criminal case against someone who'd planned and executed a deliberate attack on his own sister, then orchestrated a family-wide cover-up to avoid consequences. As the three officers prepared to make arrests, Detective Hayes reflected on how often she'd seen similar patterns in family violence cases. The entitled perpetrator who believed his needs justified any action, the enabling parents who prioritized protecting their favorite child over seeking justice for their victim, the elaborate lies that families told themselves to avoid confronting the truth about their most dangerous member. But this case felt different because of the medical professionals who'd refused to be complicit in the cover-up. Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Reeves had provided the evidence and professional expertise that transformed a family's lies into criminal charges that would stick in court. Sometimes the most important thing law enforcement could do was follow the evidence wherever it led, regardless of how many family members insisted that everyone was mistaken about what had really happened. The breakthrough came when Detective Hayes presented Maverick with the security footage from the storage facility. The grainy black and white video showed him arriving alone at 2:15 p.m., spending 20 minutes arranging furniture inside the unit, then making a phone call, the same call that had summoned me to what I thought was a simple favor between siblings. This doesn't look like someone who was surprised by a furniture moving emergency, Detective Hayes said, pausing the video at the moment Maverick positioned the massive oak cabinet against the back wall. This looks like someone setting up a scene. Maverick stared at the screen, watching himself methodically prepare what would become a crime scene. His face went through a series of expressions: denial, calculation, and finally resignation, as he realized that his lies had been systematically dismantled by professional investigators who'd seen through his performance. "I want to make a phone call," he said. "You can call a lawyer," Detective Hayes replied, "but I should tell you that we've also discovered some interesting information about your financial situation. Vincent Torino has been very cooperative about your gambling debts and the payment deadline you were facing." The mention of Vinny's name hit Maverick like a physical blow. His carefully constructed world, the successful business heir, the responsible older brother, the man worthy of Abuela's inheritance, collapsed completely as he realized that every aspect of his double life had been exposed. $50,000 owed to some very dangerous people, Rodriguez added, consulting his notes, with a deadline of next Friday, the same weekend as your grandmother's will reading, which you believed would solve all your financial problems.
The investigators had done their homework thoroughly. They tracked down Maverick's gambling associates, reviewed his bank records, discovered the money he'd been skimming from Castellano's construction. What emerged was a picture of someone whose desperation had driven him to attempt something unthinkable, seriously injuring his own sister to prevent her from attending a legal proceeding that might interfere with his inheritance plans. "Here's what we think happened," Detective Hayes said, laying out the timeline with methodical precision. "You discovered that your grandmother's will might not guarantee your inheritance. You owed dangerous people more money than you could possibly repay through legitimate means. So you decided to incapacitate your sister before Monday's will reading, believing that her absence would automatically make you the sole inheritor." Maverick's silence confirmed every detail of their reconstruction. He'd been caught not just in lies about the assault itself, but in a web of financial desperation and criminal associations that painted him as someone far more dangerous than anyone in our family had ever suspected. "The premeditation is what makes this serious," Rodriguez continued. "Renting the storage unit specifically for this purpose, choosing an isolated location, researching the kinds of injuries that would hospitalize someone without being immediately fatal. This wasn't a moment of anger. This was calculated attempted murder disguised as a family accident." The phrase attempted murder hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Up until that moment, I think even Maverick had convinced himself that what he'd done was somehow less serious than it actually was. A desperate gamble, maybe, a regrettable mistake born of financial pressure. But hearing law enforcement describe his actions in criminal terms forced him to confront the reality of what he'd become. "Your sister almost died," Detective Hayes said quietly. "The cabinet could have punctured her lung, caused internal bleeding, created complications that might have been fatal. You risked killing your own family member over money you'd gambled away." When Maverick finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to be so. I just needed her out of the way for a few days, just until the will reading was over." The confession was devastating in its casual cruelty. He'd been willing to seriously injure me, potentially kill me, for the convenience of delaying my participation in a legal proceeding. Not out of rage or passion, but as a calculated business decision that treated my life as less important than his financial problems. "Abigail Castellanos," Detective Hayes said, turning toward me for the first time since the interview had begun. "Your brother is being arrested for aggravated assault, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to commit fraud. You won't have to worry about any more accidents from your family." The arrests happened quickly after that. Maverick in handcuffs read his rights while Mom sobbed and Dad demanded to call their lawyer. Mom and Dad were charged as accessories after the fact for their coordinated cover-up efforts and pressure on me to stay silent about the assault. As I watched my family being led away in police cars, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that was difficult to process. Relief that the truth had finally been exposed, that professionals had seen through their lies and held them accountable. Sadness that the people who'd raised me had chosen to protect my attacker rather than seek justice for my injuries. But underneath both emotions was something stronger, a growing sense of my own power and worth. The medical professionals who'd spoken up for me, the investigators who'd followed the evidence despite family pressure, the legal system that had taken my assault seriously even when my own parents wouldn't, all of it proved that I mattered, that what had happened to me was wrong, and that sometimes strangers cared more about my well-being than the people who claimed to love me. Maverick had tried to destroy me to save himself. Instead, he'd revealed his own true nature and destroyed the family that had protected him his entire life. Monday afternoon brought Mr. Theodore Ashworth to my hospital room, where I was recovering from surgery to repair the internal damage Maverick's assault had caused. The family lawyer looked older than I remembered, his usually composed demeanor shaken by the weekend's revelations about the family he'd served for over 20 years. "I'm deeply sorry about what happened to you, Abigail," he said, settling into the visitor's chair with a manila envelope that I recognized from Abuela's final weeks. "Your grandmother would be heartbroken to know that her inheritance became the catalyst for such violence."
The will reading proceeded without fanfare, just the two of us in a hospital room, instead of the formal family gathering that had been planned. With Maverick in jail facing multiple felony charges, and my parents out on bail but legally barred from pressuring me about family matters, there was no audience for the revelation that would have destroyed their carefully maintained illusions. "To my granddaughter Abigail," Mr. Ashworth read from Abuela's letter, "who has always shown integrity even when it cost her dearly, you are the keeper of our family's better angels." The house on Sycamore Lane was mine, along with her art collection, her jewelry, and a trust fund I'd never known existed. But more than the material inheritance, Abuela had left me something more valuable: validation that she'd recognized the truth about both of her grandchildren long before anyone else was willing to see it. "She included a personal note for you," Mr. Ashworth said, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in Abuela's careful script. Inside, her final words to me were both heartbreaking and empowering. "Mija, if you're reading this alone, it means the family failed you when you needed them most. I pray that won't happen, but I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the people who should protect us are the ones we need protection from. You have strength you don't even know about yet. Use it to build something better than what we had." The inheritance that Maverick had tried to steal through violence was now legally and permanently mine. The house where I'd learned to paint, the studio where Abuela had taught me that creativity mattered as much as business success, the financial security that would allow me to build a life independent of family approval or support. But perhaps the most important gift was the knowledge that someone had seen my worth when the rest of my family had dismissed it. Abuela had looked past the golden child facade and recognized Maverick's true character, just as she'd seen my potential when everyone else was focused on my limitations. "There's one more thing," Mr. Ashworth said, pulling out a second document. "Your grandmother also left instructions about what should happen if any family member attempted to contest the will through violence or coercion. She was quite specific about that possibility." The secondary document revealed that Abuela had anticipated exactly what had happened. If anyone tried to prevent me from claiming my inheritance through force or intimidation, additional penalties would be triggered that would strip that person of any claim to family assets, including their position in the construction business. Maverick's assault hadn't just failed to gain him the inheritance, it had cost him everything he might have eventually inherited through legitimate means. His desperation to solve his financial problems had eliminated any possibility of future family support, even if he somehow avoided prison time. "She also established a legal fund," Mr. Ashworth continued, "specifically to ensure that you'd have resources to protect yourself from family retaliation. Your grandmother was quite thorough in her planning." As I signed the papers that made me the official owner of everything Maverick had tried to steal, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: grief for the family relationships that had been destroyed by violence and lies, gratitude for the medical professionals and investigators who'd refused to accept those lies, and underneath it all, a growing sense of my own power and independence. The inheritance gave me choices I'd never had before. I could sell the house and move somewhere far from Millbrook Heights, starting completely over in a place where no one knew about my family's dysfunction. I could keep the house and transform it into something that honored Abuela's memory while supporting other people who'd survived family violence. But most importantly, I had the resources to build a life that wasn't dependent on anyone's approval or protection. The golden child who'd tried to destroy me had instead given me the motivation and means to become everything he'd never been: independent, honest, and strong enough to stand up for myself when the people who should have protected me chose to protect my attacker instead. Abuela had been right about both of us. Maverick had revealed himself to be someone willing to commit violence for money, while I'd proven to be someone who could survive that violence and emerge stronger than before. The inheritance was mine, but more than that, the future was mine to shape without interference from people who'd spent my entire life telling me I wasn't good enough to matter. 2 years later, I stood in Abuela's art studio, my art studio now, putting the finishing touches on a painting that would be featured in the Millbrook Heights Community Center's exhibition on surviving family trauma. The converted garage had become something Abuela never could have imagined, a sanctuary, not just for my own healing, but for other people who discovered that their families weren't the safe havens they'd believed them to be. Maverick was serving a 7-year sentence for aggravated assault and attempted fraud. The gambling debts that had driven him to violence had been paid off by Vincent Torino's organization using the construction company's assets, which meant Dad's business empire had crumbled along with his golden child's reputation. Mom and Dad had received 2 years of probation for their roles in the cover-up, but the real punishment was watching their carefully constructed family image destroyed by the truth they'd tried so hard to hide. Dr. Esther Blackwood had become an unexpected mentor, inviting me to speak at medical conferences about the importance of healthcare providers recognizing family violence. "Your case changed how we train radiologists to document abuse patterns," she'd told me during our last conversation. "Sometimes one person's courage to speak the truth protects countless others who come after them." Dr. Reeves had left Millbrook General to work with a nonprofit that specialized in supporting abuse survivors through the medical and legal systems. "You showed me that sometimes the most important thing we can do is refuse to be complicit in families' lies," she'd said when she'd stopped by the house to check on my recovery. The Victorian house on Sycamore, Maine had been transformed into something that honored both Abuela's memory and my own journey toward independence. I'd kept her art collection, but added new pieces that reflected my experiences, paintings that captured the moment when lies shatter, sculptures that represented the strength required to rebuild after betrayal, installations that celebrated the strangers who become allies when family fails. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the support group that met in Abuela's former living room every Thursday evening. Survivors of family violence had grown from just me and 2 other women to a network of 15 people who'd learned that blood relationships didn't guarantee safety or loyalty. We called ourselves the Truth Tellers, and our motto was simple: some family secrets are too dangerous to keep. I'd also started a legal advocacy fund using part of Abuela's inheritance, specifically designed to help abuse survivors navigate the criminal justice system when their families coordinated to protect perpetrators. The fund had already helped 12 people get the medical documentation, legal representation, and protective services they needed to escape violent family situations. Juniper Hayes, my college friend who'd moved to Seattle, had become my closest confidant and visiting curator for the art exhibitions I now hosted quarterly. "You've turned your trauma into something that helps other people heal," she'd observed during her last visit. "That's not revenge, that's transformation." The transformation extended beyond my advocacy work. I discovered that surviving Maverick's assault and my family's betrayal had given me a kind of strength I'd never known I possessed. The accommodating daughter who'd spent her life keeping peace in the family had been replaced by someone who spoke uncomfortable truths, set firm boundaries, and refused to minimize violence for the sake of other people's comfort. When Sloan Whitmore had reached out 6 months after Maverick's conviction, asking if I thought he might be ready for forgiveness and a second chance, I'd been clear in my response. He tried to seriously injure me for money he'd gambled away. That's not something people recover from or deserve second chances for. Find someone who's never attempted murder. The bluntness had shocked her, but it had also ended the conversation permanently. I'd learned that some situations didn't require diplomacy or consideration for other people's feelings. Some truths were too important to soften for the sake of social comfort. My relationship with the extended Castellanos family had been severed completely, which had initially felt like another loss to grieve. But over time, I'd realized that losing connections with people who'd prioritized my attacker's reputation over my safety wasn't actually a loss. It was a liberation from relationships that had never been based on genuine care or respect.
The real family I'd built consisted of people who'd chosen to support me: Dr. Blackwood, Dr. Reeves, Detective Hayes, the members of my support group, and friends like Juniper who'd proven that loyalty was about actions rather than blood connections. As I stepped back to examine the painting I'd just completed, a self-portrait showing a woman surrounded by light breaking through darkness, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that Saturday afternoon in the storage facility. Maverick's assault had been intended to destroy me, but instead it had revealed my own resilience and connected me with people who valued truth over comfort. The broken ribs had healed completely. The emotional trauma had been processed through therapy, art, and advocacy work that gave meaning to my survival. But most importantly, I'd learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the foundation for building something better than what you had before. The radiologist had spoken up when my family demanded silence. That single act of professional courage had changed everything, proving that sometimes strangers care more about your well-being than the people who claim to love you. And sometimes that's exactly the kind of family you need.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.